Okay, so welcome everyone again for a conversation today on scalable interaction paradigms for pervasive computing environments. I am Susanne Woll, and together with Heiko Müller, I am hosting this conversation series in which we have every week very exciting guests. And the guest of today will be introduced and announced and also presented by Alarit Ude and Stefan Tretter. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello and welcome everyone to today's session in the conversation series. Today we will talk about a topic that we think becomes increasingly relevant as soon as we widen our perspective away from this narrow user technology interplay and towards larger computing environments, and that is the social acceptability of technology interactions. And although our project specifically deals with the aesthetics of interaction in public spaces, our early literature research on challenges that we might encounter when we design for public spaces led us to a very interesting CHI paper by Marion and her colleagues that gave an overview of the social acceptability literature in HCI. And well, long story short, today we are pleased to have her here for our conversation. But first, let me introduce her to you. Marion is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Duisburg-Essen and was previously a postdoc with the HCI lab at Saarland University. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in media informatics from LMU Munich and a PhD from the University of Oldenburg. And Marion's works were recognized with multiple awards, including a Best Paper Award at TIE and 2 honorable mention awards at CHI. Furthermore, she is also a recipient of the Helene Lange Prize and was recently awarded with the UGO Outstanding Dissertation Award. Her research interests include human-computer interaction, personal fabrication, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence, but most important for today's session is her long-lasting experience with novel interactive technologies that account for the needs, goals, and values of their users, as well as bystanders. And like I said, her expertise in designing socially acceptable technologies is why we consider her a great guest for this conversation within our SPP that basically revolves around ubiquitous, pervasive computing environments and therefore has to consider social contexts. So welcome, Marion. And before we start, please let me inform you all that there will be 2 time slots in the upcoming hour when we will have the opportunity to ask questions and have a discussion. So we will have 2 separate parts in Marion's presentation, each followed by an open discussion. So the first one in about 15 to 20 minutes from now. Yeah, with that being said, I would like to hand over to Marion. Thanks for being here and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Stefan, for the nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and talk about social acceptability in HCI. Slightly different title but very similar to the survey paper we had at CHI in 2020. But today I'm going to talk not only about methods and design strategies, but also a bit about past, present, and future. So where might we heading with social acceptability in HCI? Maybe discussing the question, can we actually design for that? Or is this maybe too challenging? We'll see. So to close the loop a bit to the SPP project, I'd like to start with a very general and probably obvious observation. So today, with computing interfaces becoming increasingly mobile and ubiquitous, HCI no longer takes place in isolation, but in front of an audience. So in a very literal sense, today we perform interactions. So interacting with computing devices becomes a performance that is done in front of an audience, which actually brings us back to the SPP project that invited me today. So how does social acceptability link to this performing interactions in front of another person? This is drawn from a theory that actually most literature, not necessarily all, in HCI that focus on social acceptability use as a basis for their work, which is the dramaturgical interaction model with the notion of impression management by Goffman. And a very characteristic property here is that we always have an internal and an external perspective. So we have the user, but we also look into bystanders, other people, people that might be looking at these interactions. And we are also looking at a continuous decision process consisting of the actual performance and the impression it creates on a bystander, who then might provide verbal or non-verbal feedback, which is fed back to the user, who might adjust their interaction with the device or maybe just abandon using the device. I don't want to dive too deeply into definitions here today, but this just as a brief background on why is social acceptability relevant for performing interactions in front of others. But social acceptability from an HCI research perspective comes with a lot of challenges. For instance, because it's most often not explicitly targeted in HCI research. So, and in practice, social acceptability, this might also have happened to you, is often encountered accidentally during in the wild studies or upon market entrance, when users are hesitant to interact with an interface, or interfaces aren't adopted when they are released to the market. And here, social acceptability often becomes apparent through its absence. So from observation, we learn much more about what are bad practices than we learn about what are good practices. And this is tricky because as researchers, we're obviously interested in how can we follow good practices. And a reason behind that is that the methodical knowledge behind social acceptability in HCI in terms of evaluation methods or agreed upon measures, or as mentioned, best practices is incredibly sparse. So it's distributed over a wide amount of papers that didn't explicitly focus on social acceptability, but touched upon it as part of their studies or encountered it by accident. And last but not least, social acceptability is also very rarely defined in HCI papers. So coming back to the question of the survey we conducted, how does HCI deal with social acceptability? How is it relevant? And I haven't shown this ever before, and it's just to give you a first idea, I did a rough plot of the ACM digital library. And this needs to be a bit taken with care because the organization of metadata in there changed from 2000 when we switched to the new model. But basically what we can see here is that there's a large amount of papers, relatively large or comparatively small, that mention social acceptability, but a much smaller fraction that actually put it in focus. And the green part you can see here are the papers that we actually did cover in our CHI 2020 survey. And we had relatively relaxed criteria for papers that put social acceptability in focus. So already trying to target it through design, or asking a simple question like, oh, how socially acceptable is this interface in a study was counted as putting it in focus. So we see that it's a relatively small amount of papers that we wanted to bring together. And this is why we wrote that survey paper, focusing on three main research questions. One of them was, how is social acceptability evaluated in HCI? How is it measured? I'm going to skip over this one today. And how can we design for social acceptability? As mentioned, we looked at papers that from 2000 to 2018, so not completely 20 years, that were original and peer reviewed. So for instance, we excluded workshop proposals and so on. We focused on papers keeping the performance model in mind that looked at the social acceptability of a user's interaction with a system. So most significantly, we excluded sociable robots. And to be included in the survey, the papers had to comprise an evaluation of social acceptability or social acceptability as explicit design goal, or provide design recommendations for socially acceptable interfaces. This yielded overall 69 papers that were meeting the inclusion criteria. Of this, 46 we looked for study methods and measures because they evaluated social acceptability, and 52 we analyzed for design strategies because they contained some design recommendation or made use of a design strategy. And I'm also going to use these two categories or these two groups of papers for the split today in today's talk, and put hopefully a nice discussion in between. So looking into method and study settings, a bit closer look. So overall, we looked at 46 papers that included a formal or an informal evaluation of social acceptability. These included to a large portion lab experiments, field experiments, or surveys, but only very, very few field surveys. So in this whole group of papers, there were only 3 works that had conducted an evaluation of social acceptability in an unconstrained field setting, so basically without the researchers present. In all others, researchers were present. And for those, the most common types of stimuli used were scenarios. They were extremely widely used, with 19 papers using them in the survey. They're a nice local stimulus, and they're extremely versatile, as you can see on this small collection I put together here. So they can range from videos to photos over animations or illustrations. And they have a large amount of benefits. I'm not going to walk through all of them today, but they include high control and internal validity, or they allow for varying levels of abstraction. But there's always a but. They also often contain an imaginative element. They often have no hands-on usage or bystander experience included. So they ask participants to imagine being in this situation. A typical description of such a study might read: participants watch the video of an actor performing the gestures in front of a wall and then perform themselves the same gestures 3 times. So this is very limited experience, especially in terms of the social context. And this is surprising because we're basically talking about evaluating social acceptability here, and context is extremely valuable there. We looked into another group of papers that were very interesting here because they tried to find a remedy for this problem, for this imaginative social context, by creating some kind of a social backdrop. So what these researchers did is that they ran, for instance, controlled experiments outside the lab. So, for instance, in shopping malls, cafes, restaurants, or just at bus stops or public transport, or busy locations on campus. Another more rarely applied strategy was to recreate social context inside the lab. In a very simple version, this can happen by inviting participants in pairs or groups. So basically, participants are asked to bring their own bystander. And one paper I especially liked, they furnished a lab space as like a social environment. In this specific case, as a living room, pretty much in the sense as usability labs are often created, and recreated this whole living room atmosphere inside their lab to evaluate social acceptability in a true social environment. And last but not least, there was another paper that I personally liked a lot, which designed an observed walk as an alternative study setting. And this is a study setting that was recently adopted by a student, Marie, I think she's also here today, whom I had the pleasure to supervise at Saarland University. And in her work on gesture-controlled hair interface, and as you can imagine, gesture-controlled hair interface is something that can spark social tension, that can be tricky in social contexts. So to evaluate this outside the lab, she adapted this study setting suggested by Lucero et al. And created a walking route as a combination of a guided and an unguided walk, visiting diverse public contexts, including a cafeteria, but also like a popular gathering area where students would sit and talk, or also the bus stop where people would just stand around and wait, but also very quiet, deserted corridors, empty streets. And on this walking route, participants were prompted with interaction prompts, as well as interview questions, and also had the opportunity to freely explore interacting with this interface. The paper is currently under submission, so I'm going to present this here just as a sneak preview and as an example for a nice outdoors meeting with COVID requirement study settings that I think should actually be adopted more. But you might also hear this already. I'm kind of arguing for going into the field, but admittedly, also many of my studies weren't conducted in the field. So one might ask, why is it actually so hard taking our prototypes into actual social context? And there's a very short answer. So in many cases, social acceptability cannot be evaluated in isolation, or at least it's extremely challenging. So what I'm going to present you here is a conceptual work published at last year's TI together with Jared Knibbe, Rachel Frere, and Paul Strohmeyer, who have extensive experience in designing and building electrode garments, and specifically here, sleeves for electrical muscle stimulation. And commonly, the framing for looking into electrical muscle stimulation is from a more technological or sensory motor perspective. So what you can also see on the right, these electrodes attached to the muscles, they raise social questions. So there's electrodes that are visible, there's movement that might be perceived weird. So actually, social is a topic in here, including aesthetic and acceptability. And this set of sleeves that Jared, Rachel, and Paul designed are an excellent example for that, because they approach this, how do the electrodes fit on there, not only from this technological and sensory motor perspective, but also from how could this fit a bit more like in a more integrated or unobtrusive fashion. And in this paper, we looked into these three sleeves from a conceptual perspective, looking into what might be there in between technological, social, and sensory motor. And we realized this is not the full picture yet. And to give you just a brief overview, I really hope you have a look at the paper. We found these three missing pieces. So it's customization, which includes, should the device fit one person perfectly, or should it be used by any person, no matter what body size? And as you can imagine, for testing with users in practice, this is a very, very important question. At the same time, manufacturing becomes relevant. So can the method be used for batch production? Can I produce multiples of those garments? Or do I always need to create a bespoke garments, which again impacts on what type of user studies can I conduct in public spaces, in social contexts? How many people can I test? And along very similar lines, deployability issues. How long does it take to apply such a sleeve? can it be put on and removed with reasonable effort, for instance? There's many more of these aspects relating to variability that we discussed in the paper. But today I wanted to take this to highlight how or why it is so hard to actually take some types of prototypes. Here I took a variable example into the field. So very often social acceptability cannot be evaluated in isolation, because if we make one change to make an interface, or in this case a variable sleeve, more socially acceptable, it might affect how comfortable it's to wear or how functional it is, or sensory motor aspects might be compromised. So in the end, to what extent or how we can conduct field research into social acceptability also relates, in this case, to other aspects of wearability, such as customization, manufacturing, or deployability. And as mentioned, this is a wearable example. So I think that this point is a very good occasion to take a short break for discussion and maybe ask you, how did you manage to take user studies into public spaces, be it wearables, be it voice interactions, be it ubiquitous computing interfaces? What does this mean for prototyping, or what challenges did you face running studies in social settings? This might be something we can discuss, but I'm open for anything else.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marion, so far for your insights into the evaluation of social acceptability. I think we can open the discussion here with your question about if anybody has experienced challenges when taking their research into the wild, and especially with regards to social acceptability and social context. Maybe you could just virtually raise your hands so I can see you. If not, maybe if you need some time to think. Marion, we already touched on this earlier, and within our team, we talked about this a few times, and that is, where do we draw the line between social acceptability and aesthetics of interaction? Don't worry, you don't have to find aesthetics, but I was wondering whether you consider social acceptability as the mere absence of negative evaluation. So you're not supposed to act like this, or I wouldn't feel comfortable interacting like this in public, or is there also a context-dependent positive upside? So, since I guess the perception of social acceptability is built on social norms, and social norms are kind of boundaries, and pushing boundaries can sometimes make for a positive experience, I guess. Yeah, so boiled down to a single question: can an interaction be socially less acceptable but still experienced more positive?
That's a really interesting question. And I know that we have been touching up on this from many different perspectives before that. So I personally am convinced that looking into social acceptability is more than just avoiding negative impressions created by technology use. So I'm convinced, as I might also show in the reminder of the talk, that there is a way to design for a positive social acceptability. I'm building this opinion primarily on Goffman's dramaturgical model and the theory of impression management, which basically means that I can create both a negative as well as a positive impression. So I would want to present myself in a way that I'm creating a positive impression with others who might observe me interacting with this technology. And I think in a very easy case, this might just be that I want to seem competent in using this technology, which is strongly tied in with user experience. So, but admittedly, this full range of where on the scale between positive and negative it's not well researched. There's an interesting Tokai paper from 2015 by Tuch and Hornbeck who look into this concept of hygienes and moderators from work psychology, who might be a starting point for looking into that. But for now, we don't know which elements create only let us reach like a zero, a neutral experience or neutral impression, and which one can actually push the boundaries towards creating a positive impression. I think this is a so far relatively under-researched area from a theoretical perspective.
So it's maybe something we have to tackle in the future.
I think so. I think we should do that.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know who was first, but maybe Marcel, you want to start?
Sure. Just when I basically, so first of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. When I listened to it, I was curious about your thoughts on the concept that maybe social acceptability can also be something that changes over time, and how to include this in studies and in the process of basically understanding the results of studies. I mean, the whole thing with people being in the bus, having like an earpiece and talking to the earpiece was something that screamed crazy person in the past, and today it's basically very, very normal. So we also see sometimes a shift in social acceptability there.
Absolutely. I think this is a super important point. So pretty naturally, social acceptability will change over time. Also, mostly because it's a continuous decision process. So one example that I always found very obvious, but so lovely to observe, is in the institute where I did my PhD, there were these groups of people doing Pokemon Go. And sometimes one of them became a group leader or kind of rose to a more senior position. And suddenly they didn't really want to, or maybe they didn't really want to be seen playing Pokemon Go with the rest of the bunch. And I think this is exactly what happens there. So it's not necessary. It can be a change in exposure. So you mentioned these Bluetooth headphones. If it becomes normalized because many people use them, the continuous decision process changed. So maybe if everyone doing it, maybe I can do that too. And at the same time, also personal changes, maybe in roles, in personal circumstances, can also trigger this continuous decision process taking a different term at some point. I don't know how we can address this in user studies other than testing at multiple points in time. I've done this so far once, where we tested at 3 points in time, each with a year in between. That's a work that's published at CHI 2017. But I have actually no other suggestion than testing at multiple points in time, or reacting or being open to things that might seem carved in stone now, to have to revise these assumptions or design strategies a couple of years from now. So, but that's an excellent point. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, sure. Would you maybe say that there are things which are more likely to become more acceptable over time than other things?
Probably. So I think exposure matters in a way. So if I see many other people using that, and I have led this argument whether this wouldn't mean, if exposure has an influence, doesn't this mean that as researchers in HCI, we don't need to bother with social acceptability? And I've always argued against that, because there's technology where social acceptability is relevant, but it doesn't have a large user base. So I'm thinking, for instance, of smart glasses being used by visually impaired users as an accessibility aid. And so there's technology that can be very useful and have a very high impact, but might never reach this amount of exposure like we have with headphones today, where everyone is using them. maybe just because not everyone needs that. And this is why I'm continue to argue for we need this methodical knowledge about how can we increase social acceptability, even if it might, even if exposure might have some say in that and might kind of relieve us of some of the weight of it. But I think for these smaller user groups, minority user groups, we need to know how exactly can we tackle this.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I think Alarit's picture is frozen, or are you still there?
I'm still here,
Frozen.
but I know my internet connection is very bad today. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, thank you also from me for this interesting first part. I have a question about how you think about social acceptability as, let's say, as a dimensional thing. So you have a technology that can be more socially acceptable and less socially acceptable in general. Or also, how do you think about, let's say, we have a phone call and I'm in a public situation, let's say on a bus, it's kind of okay or not okay. It's a mix if I call somebody on the bus, or in the silent compartment, it's completely forbidden. So there's the same type of technology interaction, but in different situations, the acceptability can be very different, right? How do you think about this flexibility of the concept, maybe?
Yeah, so I do think that social acceptability is not a unidimensional construct. I didn't yet get to publish the work we have done in towards that direction because it's not ready yet. So I need to excuse myself there, but it's certainly not unidimensional. And a typical example here could be that we might have interfaces that are very elegantly designed, that look very good from a design perspective, but that raise ethical issues. So ethics could be an issue with social acceptability because according to the theory of impression management, for instance, a user would always want to convey the best possible image of themselves, which basically would mean, oh, I want to convey I'm a good person. It also includes, oh, I want to look good, or I want to look elegant, knowledgeable, and these different dimensions of in what way a user might want to look good could be in conflict with each other. So something might be elegant but ethically questionable. And I think this is why I would strongly argue for social acceptability being a multidimensional concept, and where there could be elements of a prototype or an interface that contributes towards a better social acceptability and other elements that would contribute toward a less social acceptable, pretty much like a scale model, basically. So we put the positive on one side and the negative on the other side, which then would also support this idea of like a continuous decision process. So at any point in time, I would basically look at this virtual scale and see, okay, can I use this here in that context with that specific role I'm taking in here, and then make my decision.
Okay, thank you. Jan, is your comment on exactly this, does it relate to the dimensionality, or would it be okay if we postpone it to after the second part?
Oh, we can postpone for sure, no problem. It was a general comment on the first part of the talk, but I can go later, so we want to make sure we stay in time. That's fine.
Okay.
Cool, thanks.
Then I would just continue, and we'll make sure that your question comes first in the second discussion round. Or Stefan will make sure. Yeah, so I wanted to switch over to the third research question. As I said, I'm skipping over the one looking into how would we measure social acceptability, because it's pretty much tied to adjectives and language, and maybe not so good as a basis for a discussion. But what is certainly a good basis for a discussion is, can we actually design for social acceptability? I'm arguing that we can, and I plan to design an example for how it could work out. But I think this is definitely open for discussion. So first, I wanted to look into design strategies. So in the survey paper, we looked into all these papers mentioning a design strategy for social acceptability. Let's say, oh, we designed this in an unobtrusive fashion because this is known to increase social acceptability, or papers that actually conducted a user study and then would derive design recommendations based on that. So in any of these points, as for instance, subtlety, unobtrusiveness, and avoiding negative attention, you will always find some balance between things that are assumed and things that are the results of empirical studies. So the most common design strategy mentioned we found with overall 32 papers that were covered by our survey suggested to use unobtrusive or subtle interaction techniques. Here, because unobtrusive also can mean hidden or deceptive, it's important to notice that there's a clear trend towards unobtrusive but revealed interactions. So interactions that we emphasize but aren't secretive or hidden. I'm referring to Reeves' taxonomy of hidden or deceptive or the spectator experience here. So it's important to be unobtrusive but still convey the picture that we're an honest person, basically. And here it's interesting that of these 32 papers, roughly half provided some quantitative or qualitative verification that the strategy actually worked. So in consequence, unobtrusive is a very good strategy to increase social acceptability, but there's actually no guarantee that it will really work. So there's in fact rather the risk that it might be seen as a universal remedy to all social acceptability issues. We touched upon the ethics element in there recently. So it might be effective in some, but there can be also cases where it's not. Another strategy is to avoid suggestiveness and misinterpretation, which is to some part in contrast with the unobtrusiveness strategy. So naturally, interactions can be mistaken as nonverbal communication targeted as bystanders. In the worst case, as an insult, or if I would be scratching, maybe a sign of poor body hygiene. And here, creating a clear device focus can improve social acceptability, which has been shown by prior work. And device focus could be created, for instance, by pointing, but also if we look at how voice user interfaces are designed nowadays, maybe just by giving them a name. So we call out to Alexa to make sure that our household members don't mistakenly think we're asking them to do something. The third strategy we found is the use of accessory-like shapes and familiar styles, which is deeply grounded in the notion of wearable computing. And it's very often argued, and devices are meant to resemble non-digital accessories. And here we found only half of the overall 12 papers to provide empirical evidence. And within this half, it was very interesting that we found a very clear focus on assistive technology. So this strategy of making devices resemble non-digital accessories, and especially or regular consumer devices, so this is what we are thinking of when naming this familiar styles, has been reported to be a powerful tool in minimizing stigmata caused, for instance, by assistive technology. And last but not least, we have one more strategy, which is candidness, transparency, and justification, how we termed it. It means that the device itself provides some indication for what is done, or respectively, what is the purpose of the interaction, which can be relevant both for bystanders in terms of, okay, I get a better sense of what is happening around me, but also in terms of justification for users. So this basically means, look, I'm here, I'm interacting with my device, I'm not doing anything creepy. And what is interesting about this last strategy is that it was employed in 4 of the papers that we found, but actually 7 of the studies presented in those papers provided empirical proof for this strategy and that it actually works. So there seems to be some kind of disconnect. And since we published this paper, I've been looking into this more and more in a bit of a meta perspective. And I always wondered, okay, where does this come from? And what I did is, to get a better understanding for myself, but today I want to share it with you, is I plotted these papers with that we had in the survey along an exemplary human-centered design process. I could have taken any. I just decided for this one with the 5 phases, because for me personally, ideate and design and prototype are very important, and in many other versions they are merged. So this is a very simplified illustration of what I created or what I found. And what we see here is for each paper that we analyzed for the survey, I put 1 gray dot. As said, very simplistic, just for illustration. And we found a large number of empirical research looking into social perceptions, concerns, and issues with social acceptability, generating a huge wealth of knowledge and a very in-depth understanding. We also found user studies where prototypes are evaluated and participants are asked to rate a research prototype's social acceptability, often yielding a single score, like how socially acceptable is this, for instance. And in between, you see blank spaces. And looking into them, we see a few notable works that derive design guidelines from empirical findings, and even fewer design guidelines that are implemented actually in prototypes. So these are commonly 2 different separate areas, basically. The one focusing on artifact contributions, the others focusing on empirical contributions. And so this kind of gave me some more explanation for, okay, why is there a disconnect in our design strategies? For completeness, I also need to mention that social acceptability is very rarely evaluated in the field. So implement and deploy is a similarly large blank space. But coming back to that gap, so basically, what would we need for closing it? And so basically, we would need to learn to go from an identified need over a concrete design strategy to an even more concrete implementation concept. And this is, to some extent, the vision I'm kind of hoping to learn more about in the future. And I want to show you one example today for, I think, this might work out, which was based on my doctoral research at the University of Oldenburg, which was focused around body-worn cameras, or simply smart glasses that have an integrated camera, just like Google Glass, which are commonly reported to have low social acceptability. And we wanted to look into, okay, what's the matter with this? How can we improve this? And coming back to this gap, we had conducted works that gave us a better understanding of, okay, what's the actual problem with that? But today I rather want to focus on this large white space in the middle. So I want to talk about 2 works from my PhD time, which I do think provide an example for how we might be able to close this gap between need and implementation concept and actual prototype in the future. So we were looking into smart glasses that have an integrated camera. And one of the problems we and other prior work identified is that the camera commonly doesn't indicate whether it's on or off. And the common remedy used is, oh, let's just add an LED. But also from prior work, we learned status LED are suboptimal. They lack noticeability, understandability, they're not secure and trustworthy. So our goal was to come up with very concrete alternative design suggestions for status indicators that would indicate camera presence and status as well as the intention of use. The approach we chose was an approach of creative exaggeration, abstraction, reflection based on co-design and speculative artifacts. So we ran a two-stage method. I'm not going too much into detail here, with co-design workshops that yielded 8 speculative artifacts. And we analyzed these artifacts in detail based on fully structured interviews with HCI and UX experts for design strategies, then deriving recommendations. As we want to have time for a discussion, I jump directly to the recommendations and then to how we might implement that. So the recommendations we derive based on these speculative artifacts is that status indicators need to combine notice and consent in a meaningful way, which basically means notice has to be given sufficiently in advance before recording for consent to make any sense. Consent needs to be given, as with a user study, before the recording. And this is very tricky to implement with camera and glasses. In addition, indicators should not require learning. So color coding might work well for personal devices where the user has time to learn, but they don't work well for bystanders. The same is the case for text, where we would assume that bystanders all speak the same language. And last but not least, we realized that providing reassurance to bystanders of this camera is really off, and adapting this indicator robustly to context is key to improve trustworthiness and security. The most potent solution for implementing reassurance, though, was the physical occlusion of the camera lens. And this is very desirable because it's very intuitive and easy to understand. But at the same time, it also comes with a problem. It basically prohibits proactivity. So occluding the camera lens limits the system's ability to see. So it can no longer sense context or react autonomously. So to solve this, we came up with a solution, which is called Pervasive. It's basically a prototype for socially more acceptable smart glasses. Very rough prototype, admittedly, but it succeeds in reacting proactively to privacy-sensitive situations and automatically opening and, most importantly, reopening a physical camera shutter, which provides reassurance to bystanders and protects the user from, for instance, being hacked. I'd quickly jump over implementation details. So the key here is that we use the user's eye movement reflecting what happens around them to create this reopening of the shutter. And the prototype consists of hardware components, including this physical shutter, a scene camera, and an eye camera, as well as some image analysis in the software components and the eye movement analysis. We also ran a data annotation study, which I will not go too much into detail today, but the key here is that it provided us with a basis to distinguish between privacy-sensitive and non-sensitive situations. And in this small video, I'd like to give you a brief overview of how that vision of a system could work. So when the user takes out her wallet, the privacy sensitivity level rises and the camera shutter closes even before she takes out her credit card. So, and the same scene detection and protection works for other sensitive situations like cash withdrawal, bathroom visits, but also for interpersonal conversations. And in conversations, the shutter fulfills a second purpose, which is that it provides reassurance to bystanders. But as it also limits the system's ability to see, we have to use the eye signal to detect changes in the user's surroundings or in the user's situation. And then once the situation has changed, the shutter can open again and reassess the situation, whether it's safe to remain closed. Of course, this is more of a proof of concept implementation, but I like it especially because it shows how we might have this option of going from a need over very concrete design strategies to a concrete implementation concept that hasn't been there before. So the idea of using eye movement to reopen the physical shutter was actually motivated from the need for reassurance and proactivity, which is based on the issue that actually caused the social acceptability problem. So this is basically what I hope to gather more examples for in the future, actually. And of course, to wrap this all up here, I need to admit that there's a second wide gap. And of course, we also want to go into more field deployments, which I covered more in the first part of my talk, but then also feedback into the design process, what we learned there, to again improve social acceptability as maybe one additional core feature of user experience. And well, what do we need? It would be nice to transfer this fragmented method knowledge at some point into maybe a chapter in an HCI textbook, or maybe it's textbook on its own. And maybe we want to have even more research providing us with insights and methods, and get into a discussion about what kind of different definitions might be there. And if we can achieve this, it will give us with a better grasp on how do we design technology for everyday social life, which does not only comprise users, but it also comprises bystanders. And users can also take different roles. They can be data subjects or non-users, and even multiple roles at the same time. So I think if we can expand this methodical knowledge about how do we research social acceptability or other factors of social context, I think we can tackle this from more diverse perspectives. And with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you for your attention, and I hope for a second round of discussions.
Thank you, Marion. Is there another question you would like to ask the audience at this time, or should we dive right into Jan's
I think we can dive
question?
right in.
Sure. Thanks, Stefan. And thank you, Marion, for an exciting talk. This was great. First of all, I want to say you mentioned one paper or one theory, the stuff that Stuart Reeves did on designing the spectator experience. And I just want to reiterate that this is a really cool paper to look at.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It was, I built a bunch of interactive exhibits in the early 2000s. And this was one of the papers that, unfortunately, after I'd already built a few, kind of told me what I had been doing and helped me understand what was going on between the main user, that was using an exhibit, for example, and the folks standing around. But since you were asking for examples of people experiencing this tension, this was very clearly there when we were doing interactive exhibits. You're like in a tech museum or some kind of public space where somebody's interacting with a cool exhibit, doing stuff, experiencing something exciting. And most designs would completely forget that beside that one person that was acting with the system, there were all these people who literally were bystanders, were literally watching that person doing that thing, maybe waiting for their turn, or maybe they were, if it was designed well, they maybe didn't even need to become an active user and wait in line, but they would be happy from just seeing the person, experiencing something. So I wanted to say, I think interactive exhibits in like public environments are a great environment to see this, you know, impossible to avoid, and it is literally like, you know, the person becomes a performer in front of everybody else. But you're absolutely right, and I think this is great to throw a wider net and say, that's actually happening every time somebody's interacting with technology, and he's not completely alone. If the other thing that you brought up that I thought I wanted to maybe just jump off on, you said that, you know, people perform, right, because they want to sort of not look stupid in front of people, and it has taken me many years, but these days, if people ask me what's the single most important, you know, user need when you design a technology for people, I've come down to the baseline being just people want to feel competent. And there's so much you can derive from that assumption. Like, you don't want to fumble through trying to unlock your phone 3 times before it works, you know, this kind of stuff. And it has a lot, which I now realize, to do with the fact that we are, you know, based on the theory you proposed, we are part of a, you know, acting in front of an audience, and we are, in a way, the social acceptability is also sort of the acceptability of the individual that wants not to look stupid in front of their audience.
Absolutely.
So one other thing I was wondering about your second part. I thought the gaps in your little dot plot that you had there, which was great, the gaps were not surprising at all, because I thought, I mean, we write design guidelines, and they typically apply to all, you know, what we tell in there typically applies to like the design, ideation, maybe prototyping stage, how to build stuff. But of course, we derive these guidelines after we've made observations, or after we've done an analysis of, you know, a bunch of artifacts that we've built or that others have built. So I thought it was pretty natural that you know, papers would talk about guidelines after having done an observation analysis, but even so, the guidelines themselves, the content would actually apply to more of the, you know, constructive, the synthesizing parts of the work.
So I think you're absolutely right. So this gap it's not really surprising when you look at HCI in a general, from a general perspective. So it's not like a novel finding in this sense, but I found it to be an extremely frustrating finding. This is why I think it's important. So, and I also remember that when we submitted that work to Kai, that one of the reviewers actually criticized us in being, oh, this is not surprising. So, and I have to agree that reviewer was right. Probably, I think it was R2. He was right. R2 is right, but it doesn't make it less frustrating. And in this, because it's a very limited subset of papers, because social acceptability is not like a large or popular topic in that sense. I do think it's important, but it's not largely covered. It made this disconnect very, very apparent, with these empirical works not being pursued all the way through by the same people. And then these prototypes, on the other hand, partially making use of these findings, but sometimes also just sticking to general assumptions that, as we have shown, are to some point also right, like, oh, unobtrusiveness is always best. So yes, I agree. This is not necessarily a surprising gap, but it's a frustrating gap. And I do think it's important that we find ways to connect it and close it, because in the end, how we design these types of technologies that tackle upon social acceptability, it influences the way how we live with each other. So yes, it's not surprising, but I do think it's important to close it, or to make it less frustrating having this gap.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. And R2, that wasn't me, by the way.
Well, whoever it was, they were
this
probably
is
right.
what you say now. Cool.
Oh, yeah.
So we're past 6, but is there another comment or question? I think we could fit it in a few minutes. If that's not the case, then great. Yeah, I don't see any more hands. And if there aren't any further questions, I say let's wrap this up. Thank you all for your participation. And most importantly, thank you, Marion, for being here and sharing your expertise about the past, present, and future of social acceptability in HCI with us. Even more so since you made it possible to join us here quite spontaneously a week earlier than expected. So thanks to you, Marion, and have a nice evening to all, and see you next week, I guess.
Also, thank you for the invitation, and please extend my greetings to Sarah and Mark. I hope internet gets repaired soon.
I think Sarah was able to join, but Mark, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, I'll pass it on.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for joining the conversation series.